reviews, and today I'd like to talk about a movie that I saw just last night, the 2020 film The Dark and the Wicked, currently available for rental on various streaming platforms, including Amazon Prime. This was a film that was written and directed by Bryan Bertino, creator of 2008's The Strangers and 2016's The Monster. And the format of this video is something that I'm going to be trying my hand at. I did it a little bit in October, and I think I might turn it into a regular thing. So I'd really welcome your comments if you like this format. It doesn't quite fit the YouTube narrative, but basically what I'll be doing is starting out with a spoiler-free review and then with a bit of a warning, transitioning into a more of a spoiler-filled discussion, not necessarily breaking the entire movie apart, but at least being able to talk about one or two bullet points that I'd like to openly and freely. Again, that really doesn't fit YouTube's algorithmic efforts of success with maintaining audience interaction all the way through the end of a video. I couldn't care a fig. I just want something that people will enjoy. So if this is something that you like, please comment and I will make it more of a regular thing. And to get into the spoiler-free plot synopsis, we are introduced to the character of Louise, played by Marin Ireland, and Michael, played by Michael Abbott Jr., as brother and sister, and they go to their old family farmhouse to help their mother out. You see, their father is not doing so well. He's kind of on his last legs of care. He has a nurse that comes in and takes care of him during the day, but at night, it's just their mother trying to care for him as best as is possible, and things are just not going terribly well. It's a tough time for the family. There's a little bit of tension and some elements of estrangement going on, building and repairing bridges that have been broken and burnt over the course of many years as they attempt to pull themselves together, come together as a family unit.
She needed someone. I think you both know that now.
And unfortunately, in the face of that, there are supernatural elements that are taking place that are complicating matters, to say the least. Now, for me personally, I was very pleasantly surprised by this movie. I knew that it was directed by Bryan Bertino, and that was it. I knew nothing about it going into it, and I would be lying if I said that I thought that this was the best movie I've seen this year. But what I will say is that it is absolutely the most terrifying movie that I have seen this year. Oftentimes, as a film critic for horror movies and seeing so many of them, there tends to be a little bit of a desensitization going on where it's tough to find things scary anymore. You can dissect the quality of characters and storyline and plot elements and technical elements and so forth till the cows come home, and you can find very fine films in that analysis, but to actually be scared by them becomes a little bit rare, and this movie scared me. I watched it just last night, and when I was done, I had to turn all the lights off downstairs to come upstairs to bed, and it was one of those I'm alone in the dark moments. And that's rare. That really doesn't happen to me very often anymore. So hats off to this movie for eliciting that emotion. That's a thrill and a half, and I'm very pleasantly surprised to see that I can still feel that way. But beyond just the scares, I thought this was a very beautiful movie that struck very difficult tones of guilt, grief, and isolation, especially isolation. Between the camera work, the sound design, the editing, and the characters, this provided an extremely well done, haunting atmosphere that had some terrifying visuals that did sometimes border on cheap thrills. But I think it never really crossed that border for me. It just kind of eked up to it enough, and considering the strength of the rest of the movie, I think I can forgive it for those moments. This also was very unabashed about exploring some very difficult dynamics of a family relationship. The fact of the matter is, when we have children that look after us as we get older, unfortunately, not every death is going to be quick and peaceful and painless. Sometimes it's prolonged, sometimes it's difficult to watch, and sometimes that can affect our loved ones. And that is kind of one of the core elements of this movie. And it is pretty brutal in how it portrays it, both in the realistic aspects of home care, as well as the supernatural aspects that challenge the characters above and beyond. But I do think, in all fairness, that one of the things holding me back from making that grand claim of best movie of the year so far is the fact that I was a bit let down by some of the conclusions of some core story elements. The way that the storyline wrapped up some of the characters and some of the core conflicts did feel a little bit lackluster and a little bit more, well, I think it broke the tension, to be perfectly honest, and unfortunately led for a little bit of a lackluster ending, but a very solid film up until that point. Despite not having the strongest punctuation mark put on it, I do think that this was still a film that was terrifying, touching, beautiful, and powerful. And so on that basis, I would absolutely recommend the 2020 movie, The Dark and the Wicked. Yes, it did feel a little slow in some places. Some of the pacing was a little bit, let's just say, deliberate, and some of the scares, to reiterate, did feel a little bit cheap, but that was only some of them in a movie that was riddled with good scares. And between the emotions of heartbreak that I felt while watching this movie and fear after I finished watching it and found myself alone in the dark, I would say that that makes for a grand recommendation at the very least. And so I think that about wraps up the spoiler-free portion of this. There are one or two things that I would like to touch on in a more of an open discussion. So if you care about spoilers, or if you haven't seen this movie, please stop watching now. All right, so full open discussion from here on out. Now, I think one of the things that worked well for me on this film, and it was, well, at least in terms of how well it resonated with me, was the fact that me personally, I have a very fractured and estranged relationship with my immediate family. And again, for me, I think that no matter what led to that, whatever trauma or abuse or arguments or anything that led to that fracturing, and who said what to who, and who's right and who's wrong, and who has the moral high ground, whatever the circumstances are, there's always that level of guilt. That when that fracturing is there, especially in terms of when one side is in need of assistance and the other side doesn't have the mental or emotional wherewithal to expose themselves to that level of trauma again, it becomes very difficult, and that guilt is really real. Now, this movie doesn't do a very good job, in my opinion, of explaining the circumstances behind Louise and Michael's estrangement from their family. It doesn't seem like that there's, a blood feud going on that purposefully keeps them away. It seems more like life just kind of drifted them apart, and as their lives got busier, their relationship got further and further apart from their mother and father, and now they're in a situation where they're watching their mother emotionally and psychologically deteriorate and their father physically deteriorate, and that makes it all the more difficult. So there is guilt, there is a difficult level going on there, and I think that's one of the core elements of this, is not wanting to expose oneself to the degree of inflicting harm upon oneself. I think that that's one of the most difficult things about watching a family member deteriorate to that level, is how much it takes away from you. It is not a benign circumstance. It is a very malignant situation in which everybody gets affected, and some people need to tap out. And that is a tough thing to bear. And I think that that was kind of the core element of the demonic or supernatural or what have you elements of what was going on here, was to take a magnifying glass to those conflicts and those emotions and those really deep character traits that are tough to reconcile, as well as developing that relationship with the audience, because so many of us have had to go through very similar things with our family members and our loved ones, and have had that piece of our heart taken away as we watch them in the bed. I think for me, as far as films that are able to take that magnifying glass and shine it on a very difficult family dynamic, I could easily compare this movie to Relic. And I'm not going to say any spoilers on Relic, but what I will say is that although the two movies work really well in how well they dissect the family elements that they are doing in the supernatural framework, I think that Relic does a better job of bringing it home. I think the trouble that I had with the ending of this film is that for all the introspection and dissection of those difficult character moments, it doesn't really provide a path to resolution in the same way that I think Relic did. A movie that does this good of a job at really latching onto the audience heartstrings, I think that it owes itself to also look at the healthy emotional and psychological ways that we can deal with and cope with those family issues, and then fold that into the supernatural narrative that the movie is allowing us to explore. I think it touched on it. I think it kind of really, it got there very closely with some of the last things that Michael said to Louise, with some of the things that the nurse said to Michael, and with what Louise brought herself to doing towards the end. It kind of got there. It got so close. But then that one last fraction of a second and then ending credits kind of just out the window. The fact that she forced herself to stay, that this soul would not leave its body alone, that it would not have to endure this tragedy of slipping past the mortal coil and into the arms of death alone, that she would be by his side, perhaps giving too much of herself, sure, but this was her father, and she would do what she felt was best for him in a selfless moment. And then it bled for a good shock moment before the end credits rolled, but honestly, I think that it kind of defied the rest of the film. I think that it kind of took a lot of the elements of character growth and storyline elements and core conflicts, and it kind of just shoved them into the wastebasket, and I felt that that was a bit of a shame. Again, I really don't think that that is so bad that it mars the rest of the film. I don't think that in retrospect that it sullied the film for me, but it certainly did prevent it from elevating above and beyond, and considering that we're talking about an element that could have easily been rewritten or just thrown away, we're talking about literally a half second of something that could have easily wound up on the cutting room floor. I think that that was just a bit of a shame. In a movie where I said that it bordered on having some cheap shock moments, but never really crossed it, I think that that may have been a little bit disingenuous in retrospect, and I would say that that last shock moment was the one that felt cheap. And so I think that should about wrap this up. That should about do it. Thank you so much for joining me here today. It really means a lot to me. And if you like this, please click like and subscribe. It helps me out way more than you know. Beyond that, remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.